My grandfather warned me not to open the hidden basement door. The first thing I noticed was that the ivy had been cut, not trimmed neatly, cut from the inside. A narrow opening had been carved through the overgrown wall of vines behind my grandfather's house, just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. I stood at the edge of the backyard with a grocery bag against my hip, staring at the dark gap. My grandfather had lived in that house for 43 years. I had visited him almost every Sunday since my grandmother died. I knew the cracked bird bath, the rusted clothesline, the loose fence board near the alley, but I had never seen a door behind that bush. I set the groceries on the porch and crossed the yard. The opening led to 3 concrete steps descending below ground level. At the bottom was a narrow wooden door painted the same dull green as the foundation. There was no handle on the outside, only a small brass keyhole. I pulled out my phone and called my grandfather. He answered after 6 rings. "Where are you?" I asked. "At the pharmacy." His voice sounded strained, but that wasn't unusual anymore. At 82, even short errands exhausted him. "I'm behind the house," I said. "There's a door under the ivy." Silence, not confusion. Silence. "Grandpa, leave it alone, Nora." I looked at the cut vines around the opening. "You know about it." I said leave it alone. The line went dead. My grandfather had never hung up on me before. I was still standing there when I heard movement behind the door. A scrape. Then something heavy struck the wood from the other side. I backed away. "Hello?" No answer. I called again. The scraping stopped. A minute later, a car door slammed in the driveway. My grandfather came around the side of the house without his pharmacy bag. His face was pale, and one hand trembled around his cane. "What did you touch?" he demanded. "Nothing." He pushed past me and examined the door. "Was it open?" "No." "Did you see anyone?" I heard someone. He turned so quickly that he nearly lost his balance. "What did you hear?" "Movement." Something hit the door. He stared at the keyhole, then he looked toward the alley. "Go inside." "Grandpa?" "Now." His fear frightened me more than the hidden entrance. Inside, he locked the back door, closed every curtain, and checked the basement door twice. I watched him from the kitchen. "What is that room?" He filled a glass with water but didn't drink it. "It used to be a coal cellar." "Used to be?" The house was converted to gas before I bought it. "Why is the entrance hidden?" "Because it isn't safe." "That doesn't explain why someone cut the ivy." He placed both hands on the counter. "You didn't see anyone?" "No." He nodded as though confirming something to himself. "Then forget it." I wanted to press him, but he suddenly looked older than he had that morning. His shoulders had folded inward. Sweat shone along his hairline. I checked his blood pressure, made him sit down and unpack the groceries. While I put soup in the cupboard, I noticed something missing from the hook beside the refrigerator. His basement key. My grandfather kept 3 keys there: the garage, the basement, and the old padlock on the shed. The basement key was gone. "Did you lend someone your key?" I asked. He looked toward the empty hook. "No." "You're sure?" His hesitation lasted less than a second. "Yes." That was my first clue, not the missing key, the lie. I stayed until evening. My grandfather refused to discuss the hidden door again. He ate half a bowl of soup, complained about the weather, and asked whether I was still thinking of replacing my car. He was trying too hard to make the afternoon ordinary. Before I left, I checked the basement door. Locked. "Call me if you hear anything," I said. "I won't." "That isn't what I asked." He gave me a tired smile. "I'll call." I parked on the street instead of driving home. From there, I could see the alley behind his property in my rearview mirror. At 9:17, a figure emerged from behind the garage. A man. He wore a dark jacket and carried a canvas bag. He moved quickly through the shadows and disappeared behind the wall of ivy. He knew exactly where the entrance was. I called the police. By the time 2 officers arrived, the hidden door was locked and the room beyond it was empty. They opened it with a pry bar after my grandfather claimed he had lost the key. The coal cellar was larger than I expected. Its concrete walls had been painted white years ago, though damp stains had spread across the lower half. A narrow cot stood against one wall. Beside it sat a portable heater, a battery lantern, and 3 plastic storage bins. Someone had been living there, not long ago. The blanket on the cot still held the shape of a body. A paper cup on the floor contained coffee that was lukewarm. An open package of crackers sat beside a cheap prepaid phone. One officer lifted the lid of the first storage bin. Clothes, men's jeans, sweaters, and 2 pairs of shoes. The second contained canned food, bottled water, and basic medical supplies. The third was empty except for several torn pieces of paper. My grandfather stood in the doorway, gripping his cane. "I had no idea," he said. The officer looked at him. "You didn't know someone was staying beneath your house?" "No." I watched my grandfather's face. He seemed frightened. But he didn't seem surprised. The officers searched the room and found no identification. The prepaid phone had been wiped clean. The papers in the bin had been torn into strips too small to read without reassembling them. One officer asked whether my grandfather had family nearby. "Only my granddaughter." "Any former tenants?" "No." "Anyone who might have access to the basement?" "No." I almost corrected him. The missing key. The officer noticed a narrow closet built into the far wall. Inside were shelves stacked with old paint cans and jars of screws. Nothing unusual. Then I saw a clean arc in the dust on the floor. One of the shelves had moved recently. I pulled on it. The entire shelving unit swung outward. Behind it was a wooden hatch. The officer opened it and shone his flashlight through. On the other side was my grandfather's main basement. The hatch opened behind the storage closet under the stairs. Someone could enter through the concealed exterior door, sleep in the hidden room, and pass directly into the house without ever going upstairs through the basement door. The officer crawled through. A minute later, he called us over. There were muddy footprints on the main basement floor. They led to the bottom of the stairs, and then they disappeared. The stairs led directly to the kitchen. Someone had been entering my grandfather's home. The police treated it as a burglary. They photographed the room, collected the phone and torn papers, and advised my grandfather to stay somewhere else until the locks were changed. He refused. "I'm not leaving my house." "You may have had an intruder living under you," one officer said. "Then he's gone. You don't know that." My grandfather looked at the hidden hatch. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." The officer didn't notice the certainty in his voice. "I did. After they left, I told my grandfather to pack a bag." "No, you're staying with me?" "No, someone has been inside your house. He never hurt me." The words escaped before he could stop them. I stared at him. My grandfather sat down on the basement steps. For several seconds, all I heard was the hum of the furnace. "You know who he is," I said. He rubbed both hands over the top of his cane. "I know who I think he is." "Who?" He looked at me. "Your father." I laughed once, not because it was funny, because it was impossible. My father had died when I was 6. At least, that was what I had always been told. He had been driving home during a storm when his car went through a guardrail and into the river. The vehicle was recovered downstream. His body was not. My mother had raised me alone until she died 12 years later. My grandfather had been the one constant in my life. "You told me he died," I said. "We believed he did." "Believed?" The police found his car. His wallet was inside, there was blood on the dashboard, but no body. "No," I leaned against the wall. "You knew he might be alive." "Not then." "When?" My grandfather looked toward the hidden room. 3 months ago. He had found the exterior door open one morning. At first, he thought teenagers had broken in. Then he discovered food missing from the kitchen and a blanket taken from the hall closet. He began leaving groceries in the cellar. "A few days later, I saw him," he said. "Just for a second. And you recognized him after all these years? He had your father's face. My father would be 61. He looked older. That doesn't prove anything." "No. Did you speak to him?" "He wouldn't let me come close." "Did he tell you his name?" "No." "Then why would you?" "Think he's my father?" My grandfather reached into his shirt pocket. He removed a silver watch. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my grandmother. She had given it to my father when he graduated from college. I had seen it in family photographs. The back was engraved with his initials. GRH. "He left this on the basement steps," my grandfather said. I turned the watch over in my palm. It felt heavier than it should have. "Why didn't you call the police?" "I was afraid he would disappear." "He did disappear. Not until you found the entrance." The accusation was gentle, but it still struck me. You let a man hide under your house because he had an old watch? I needed to know. Know what? Why he left. My grandfather had not spent 3 months sheltering a frightened stranger because he believed my father had survived an accident. He believed my father had staged it. That night, I stayed at the house. We changed the locks ourselves. I wedged a chair beneath the kitchen doorknob and kept the basement lights on. My grandfather slept in his recliner. I didn't sleep at all. At 2 in the morning, the prepaid phone in the hidden room began to ring. The police had left it after failing to extract anything useful. I stared at the glowing screen. The number was blocked. I answered. No one spoke. Who is this? Breathing, slow and uneven. My grandfather thinks you're Grant Hale. The breathing stopped. Then a man whispered, ask him what happened at Miller's Crossing. The call ended. I woke my grandfather. At the name Miller's Crossing, the color drained from his face. What is it? I asked. An old railroad bridge. What happened there? Nothing. That man told me to ask you. My grandfather looked toward the basement door. He's not your father. 5 hours earlier, he had been cert. What changed? He wouldn't have said that. Why not? Because Grant didn't know about Miller's Crossing. Then who did? My grandfather stood and walked to the kitchen window. My brother. I had known my grandfather once had a younger brother named Simon. According to family history, Simon had left town before I was born. My mother rarely mentioned him. My grandfather never did. What happened at the bridge? I asked. He kept his back to me. In 1978, Simon was arrested for armed robbery. You told me he moved west. He did. After prison, was he guilty? Yes. You're sure? I testified against him. The answer explained the silence that had surrounded Simon's name. My grandfather had been working nights at a warehouse. One evening, he saw Simon load stolen electronics into a van. When police questioned him, he told the truth. Simon served 11 years. When he got out, he blamed me for everything, my grandfather said. He said I had chosen strangers over my own blood. What does that have to do with my father? Grant started visiting him. Why? He felt sorry for him. Your father always believed people deserved another chance. Simon and Grant had secretly rebuilt their relationship. My grandfather disapproved. The brothers argued. Grant accused him of abandoning Simon after prison. A week before my father's disappearance, Simon had called and demanded a meeting at Miller's Crossing. My grandfather went alone. What happened? He wanted money. He said Grant had gotten involved in something dangerous trying to help him. What kind of thing? He wouldn't say. Did you give him money? No. My grandfather turned toward me. The next morning, Grant's car went into the river. The obvious theory was that Simon had killed my father. But the man in the cellar had my father's watch, and he knew about a meeting my father supposedly never knew had happened, unless my father had known, unless my grandfather was still hiding something. The police returned later that morning. They had reconstructed several pieces of paper from the storage bin. One was part of a bus schedule. Another contained a string of numbers. The third was a fragment of an old newspaper article. The visible headline read, "Local man missing after river crash my father's disappearance." The article had been marked in red ink. One sentence was circled. Authorities believe Grant Hale was alone in the vehicle. Beneath it, someone had written, he wasn't. That changed the question. I had been asking whether my father had survived. Now I wondered who had been in the car with him. The police traced the canvas bag seen in my security footage to a shelter across town. A volunteer remembered an older man who used the name Samuel Green. He had stayed there twice during the winter. He carried no identification. But he had asked for newspaper archives from 1996, the year my father vanished. I went to the public library. The original reporting contained details my family had never discussed. A witness had seen my father's car parked near Miller's Crossing 40 minutes before the crash. Another driver reported seeing 2 people arguing beside it. The witness described the second person as a man in a tan coat. In an old family photograph, Simon wore a tan coat. That seemed almost too simple. Simon met my father, they fought. The car went into the river, my father died. Simon took his watch. But then why hide in my grandfather's cellar 30 years later? I requested the police accident report. The librarian helped me access a scanned copy from the county archive. The windshield had been shattered outward. There was blood on the dashboard, but the sample was too small for identification methods available at the time. The driver's seat was positioned far back. My father was 5'9". Simon was 6'3". The car had been driven by a tall man. I called my grandfather from the library. How tall was Simon? He didn't answer. You knew he was in the car. I suspected. No, you knew. I saw him later. The words came slowly. After the crash, 3 nights after, my grandfather had been closing the hardware store where he worked when Simon appeared in the parking lot. His face was bruised. One arm was in a sling. He said Grant was alive. He also said Grant never wanted to see the family again. What did you do? I asked. I told him to bring Grant home, and he said Grant would come back when it was safe. Safe from what? He wouldn't tell me. Did you call the police? My grandfather said nothing. You let everyone believe Dad was dead. Simon threatened your mother. I closed my eyes. He said if I involved the police, the people looking for Grant would come after all of you. Who was looking for him? I never knew. That was the moment I stopped believing my grandfather was protecting me. He was protecting himself from the truth of what his silence had caused. I returned to the house and searched the hidden room again. The police had removed the torn papers, but the rest remained. I examined every can, box, and crack in the walls. Inside the portable heater, behind the removable battery panel, I found a folded receipt. It came from a pharmacy 2 towns away. The purchase was for insulin. The date was 6 days earlier. At the bottom was a customer number. The pharmacy refused to give me information, so I called from my grandfather's phone and claimed we had received the wrong prescription. The technician corrected me. No, Mr. Hale's insulin was picked up under his standing assistance account. Mr. Hale, not Green, the account had been opened 18 months earlier. The patient's first name was Simon. The man in the cellar was my great-uncle, not my father. When I confronted my grandfather, he didn't deny it. You knew. I became sure last month. Why didn't you tell me? Because Simon said he could prove Grant was alive. He manipulated you. Maybe. Where is he now? I don't know. That was another lie. I could hear it more clearly now. I searched the kitchen, the bedroom, and the small desk where my grandfather kept bills. In the trash beneath the desk, I found an envelope from a storage facility. The unit was rented in my grandfather's name. He gave me the key after I threatened to call the police and tell them he had knowingly sheltered Simon. The storage unit contained no furniture, only 3 cardboard boxes and a battered metal trunk. The boxes held newspaper clippings, maps, and photocopies of my father's bank records. The trunk held a cassette recorder and 14 labeled tapes. Most were conversations between my grandfather and Simon. The earliest had been recorded 3 months ago. My grandfather had not simply fed Simon, he had questioned him. On the first tape, Simon claimed my father had staged his death to escape men connected to stolen military equipment. On the second, he said my father had fled to Canada. On the third, he said Mexico. Each story changed whenever my grandfather challenged it, but one detail remained consistent. My father had been in the car at Miller's Crossing. They had argued. Simon drove away with him. Near the river, another vehicle forced them off the road. Both men escaped before the car sank. On the 7th tape, my grandfather asked, "Why did Grant leave his wallet?" Simon answered, "Because he wanted them to think he was dead." "Then why did he leave his watch with you?" A long pause followed. "He didn't." The recording ended. Tape 8 began with shouting. My grandfather demanded the truth. Simon said, "You already know the truth, you just want a different one." Then I heard a sound that made me replay the tape 3 times, my grandfather crying, not quietly, brokenly. "I saw the blood in your coat," he said, "that night behind the store." "I knew it wasn't yours," Simon replied. "Then why did you let me walk away?" The midpoint of the mystery arrived not as a dramatic confession, but as a terrible absence. My grandfather had known Simon's story was false from the beginning. He had allowed my mother and me to believe my father drowned because admitting the truth would require admitting his own cowardice. I listened to the remaining tapes. Simon never clearly confessed. He circled the truth, bargaining with fragments. He wanted money, medication, and a place to hide. In exchange, he promised evidence that Grant had survived. The final tape had been recorded 4 days before I found the hidden entrance. My grandfather said, "There is no evidence, is there?" Simon answered, "There's the watch. You took it from him?" "Yes." "Before or after?" Silence. "Before or after you killed him?" The tape clicked off. I sat alone on the storage unit floor, surrounded by 30 years of grief. There was still one missing piece. A body, a weapon, a place, something that could transform suspicion into truth. I returned to the number written on the torn paper. The police had assumed it was a phone number, but it contained too many digits. I copied it beside the old bus schedule. Then I noticed the schedule listed route numbers and mile markers. The string could be separated into 3 parts. Route 17, Mile 42, Section 6. Miller's Crossing sat near Route 17. I drove there before sunset. The railroad bridge had been abandoned for years. Weeds grew between the tracks, and the river moved slowly beneath rusted beams. Mile marker 42 stood half a mile east. Beyond it, the land dropped into a wooded ravine. Section markers had once identified maintenance zones along the rail line. Most were gone, but I found a faded number 6 nailed to a post. Near it, the earth dipped in a long, shallow line. Not a grave, a drainage tunnel. The concrete opening had been covered with branches. Inside, I found recent food wrappers, empty insulin vials, and my grandfather's missing basement key. Simon had moved from the cellar to the tunnel. At the back was another canvas bag. It contained cash, a small knife, and a sealed plastic pouch. Inside the pouch was my father's college ring. There was also a driver's license issued under another name. The photograph showed Simon, 20 years younger, and a handwritten map marked with an X farther down the ravine. I called the police before following it. They arrived with search dogs and crime scene technicians. The X led to an area beneath a collapsed retaining wall. Human remains were found under 3 feet of soil. The medical examiner later determined they had been there for approximately 30 years. A healed fracture in the left wrist matched my father's medical records. The ring was not the proof. The bones were. Simon was arrested at a bus station that night. He had my grandfather's cash in his coat and a ticket to Philadelphia in his pocket. For 2 days, he refused to speak. Then the police showed him photographs of the remains. He asked for a lawyer. The final explanation came from the evidence, not a confession. My father had discovered that Simon was using stolen identification documents to sell vehicles under false names. Grant threatened to report him. Simon persuaded him to meet at Miller's Crossing, claiming he wanted to surrender. They argued beside the car. My father got into the passenger seat because Simon said the forged documents were hidden near the river. Simon drove. At the drainage tunnel, he attacked my father with a tire iron. He moved the body into the ravine, pushed the car into the river, and left my father's wallet inside. The blood on the dashboard came from Simon's injured arm. 3 nights later, he appeared before my grandfather and invented the story about dangerous men. My grandfather saw blood on Simon's coat and understood enough to suspect the truth, but Simon offered him something stronger than reason. Hope. He said Grant was alive. My grandfather chose to believe him. For 30 years, Simon kept the watch and ring as insurance. If he ever needed help, he could use them to reopen the wound. When his health failed and he had nowhere else to go, he returned. He discovered the old coal cellar entrance and began living beneath the house. At first, my grandfather truly didn't know who was there. Then Simon left the watch. My grandfather unlocked the hatch, brought him food, and began recording their conversations. He wasn't protecting Simon. He was trying to force him to reveal where my father had been buried. The number on the paper was not left for me. It was written by my grandfather during one of their conversations, after Simon accidentally mentioned the old section marker. My grandfather had been close to solving it, but he had hidden too much for too long. A week after the remains were identified, I sat with him at the kitchen table. He looked smaller than I remembered. I thought if I could bring Grant home, he said, it might repair what I did. You couldn't repair it. I know. You let my mother die believing he abandoned us in death. His eyes filled. I know. You let me grow up without the truth. I know. There was no explanation that could make his choice acceptable. Fear had played a part, so had love, but beneath both was selfishness. He had chosen a comforting possibility over a painful responsibility. Simon had lived in the hidden room for 3 months. My grandfather had lived inside his own hidden room for 30 years, one built beneath the house, the other built from silence. The exterior entrance was sealed with concrete that autumn. The closet hatch was removed. I kept my father's watch, but gave the ring to the police until the trial ended. Simon was convicted without ever admitting what he had done. The evidence had been waiting in the ravine, in the tapes, and in the contradictions he could not stop creating. My grandfather testified. It did not erase his silence, but it ended it. The central question had seemed simple when I first saw the cut ivy. Who had been living beneath my grandfather's house, and did he know? The answer was Simon. Yes, my grandfather knew, but that was only the surface. The deeper truth was that Simon had not returned because he needed a place to hide. He returned because he knew my grandfather had spent 30 years waiting for permission to believe a lie, and he thought that made him safe. He was wrong.